Thank you all for being here. Some of you are probably wondering why I'd throw a party for this, but honestly, I've never felt more free. 15 years, and I finally get to build a life that actually fits me.
There were 200 people in my backyard the night my husband celebrated the end of our marriage, and not one of them knew that the woman standing quietly near the bar holding a glass of wine she never once drank had already spent 4 months building the case that would end his career, his freedom, and the life he thought he'd gotten away with. My name is Renee Ashford. I was 44 years old. I had been married to Marcus Ashford for 15 years. And on the night he rented a white tent, hired a live band, and stood on a small wooden stage to toast his own freedom in front of everyone we had ever known. I stood in that crowd wearing the calmest expression I have ever worn in my life, because I already knew something Marcus did not. I knew that by morning, everything he had spent 2 years building in secret was going to collapse in front of the very people he had invited to watch him win. He wanted an audience for his ending. He got one. He just never imagined that his own downfall would be the thing they actually witnessed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I need to take you back to the beginning, because you won't understand what happened in that backyard unless you understand exactly what Marcus and I built together, and exactly what he was willing to destroy to protect himself. I met Marcus when I was 26 years old at a fundraiser I almost didn't attend that night. He wore a gray suit slightly too big in the shoulders, the kind of suit a young man wears when he's dressing for the career he wants rather than the one he actually has yet. He introduced himself twice because the room was loud and he wanted to be certain I had heard him. I thought that was charming at the time. I would understand years later that Marcus rarely said anything only once if he could help it. Repetition was how he built belief in every room he ever walked into, including the one we shared as husband and wife. He was ambitious in the specific way that feels magnetic when you are young and still discovering the shape of your own future. He spoke about buildings the way other men speak about sports, with statistics and reverence and a kind of hunger that made you want to believe in whatever he described next. I was working in interior design then, still early in my career, still learning which fabric samples actually survive 5 years of a real family living on top of them. Marcus told me once that he liked how practical I was. He said he needed someone practical beside him because he already had enough people around him who simply told him yes to everything. We married when I was 28 years old in a small ceremony far smaller than either of our mothers wanted. Marcus told me he didn't need 200 guests to prove the marriage was serious. I remember holding on to that sentence for years afterward, believing it revealed something true and steady about the man I had chosen. For a long time, it did. I want to be honest with you about that, because stories like this one often get flattened into simple villains and simple victims, and ours did not start that way. For the first several years, Marcus worked constantly and I built my design business slowly, one referral and one late night at a time. We called it a partnership. That was his word, not mine, though for many years I believed it completely. The shift happened gradually, the way the most important shifts in a marriage almost always do. There was no single betrayal I could point a finger toward. Instead, there was a slow redirection, of attention first, then of resources, and eventually of honesty itself. Marcus's development company grew from small residential renovations into large commercial projects. Entire city blocks he acquired and rebuilt over 18 months at a time. Money that used to move through accounts I could see clearly began moving instead through structures I did not fully understand. When I asked questions, Marcus always had smooth, reasonable-sounding answers. Tax efficiency, liability protection, standard practice for a business operating at that scale. I believed him because I had no specific reason not to, and because doubting a husband of 15 years requires a kind of evidence most people never go looking for until something forces their hand. Vivian Cole joined Marcus's company as a project coordinator when I was 41 years old. I met her exactly twice before everything came apart, both times briefly, at company holiday gatherings that lasted less than 10 minutes. She was polished in a way that read on the surface as simple competence rather than performance. Sharp, attentive, the kind of woman who remembers names easily and follows up on small promises without being asked twice. I liked her in those brief conversations. I had no reason then to feel otherwise. What I did not know, what I would not learn until much later, was that Vivian had slowly become the person Marcus trusted with the parts of his business he no longer discussed with me at all. She managed accounts I never saw. She signed documents I never reviewed. She became, gradually and then completely, the person occupying the exact space where I once stood beside him. I noticed the distance in our marriage before I understood its actual shape. Marcus began working later into the evening. He started taking phone calls sitting in his car in our own driveway instead of inside our house. He mentioned Vivian's name so often, so casually, that I eventually stopped registering it as anything significant at all. That is a mistake I have thought about many times since. how the most important information in your life often arrives disguised as nothing worth noticing. My younger sister Grace noticed the shift before I allowed myself to. Grace has always been the sharper of the two of us, less willing to extend the benefit of the doubt long after that doubt has stopped being reasonable. She mentioned once over coffee on an ordinary Sunday that Marcus seemed different lately. Distracted, she said, distant. I remember defending him instinctively, telling her he was simply under pressure from the downtown project. Grace didn't push the subject that day. She only looked at me the way sisters do when they are quietly deciding whether something is worth repeating a second time. I want to tell you honestly about the woman I was before I understood what was actually happening around me because I believe it matters to this story. I was not naive. I ran my own business. I managed contracts and client relationships and contractors who occasionally tried to overcharge me because they assumed a woman wouldn't check their math carefully. I always checked the math. I was careful professionally in nearly every part of my life, except for the one part I had built my entire adult identity around trusting without question. By the time I turned 43, the signs had accumulated past the point where I could keep explaining each one away individually. Marcus began asking me to sign documents quickly, standing at our kitchen counter always between meetings, always framed as routine, refinancing paperwork, corporate filings. He would slide the papers across to me with a pen already uncapped, talking the entire time about something unrelated, filling the silence so completely that the act of signing became almost incidental background noise beneath a conversation about his day. I signed. Of course I signed. He was my husband of 15 years. You do not read every line of every document your husband hands you once you have built that many years of trust together. You allow the relationship itself to have already done that reading on your behalf. Looking back now, I understand that this was entirely deliberate. Marcus was not simply asking for my signature in those moments. He was training me to sign quickly without scrutiny, to associate the appearance of any document with the comfortable sound of his voice discussing something else entirely. It is a specific kind of conditioning, and I do not describe it dramatically. I describe it plainly because once I finally slowed down enough to examine exactly what I had signed over those years, I understood precisely how carefully that pattern had been constructed around me. The moment that changed everything happened on an entirely ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was searching through a filing cabinet in Marcus's home office, a room I rarely had reason to enter, looking for a property tax statement connected to our homeowner's insurance renewal. Instead, I found a folder I did not recognize, tucked carefully behind older files, labeled with a company name I had never once heard Marcus mention in 15 years of marriage: Ashworth Property Holdings. Not Ashford, our actual name. Ashworth, one single letter different, close enough that a quick glance would read it as entirely familiar, different enough that it was not ours at all. I sat down on the floor of that office and read through the entire folder for nearly 40 minutes without moving. Corporate formation documents. A registered agent listed clearly as Vivian Cole. Property transfers, 3 separate transfers, moving ownership of buildings I recognized immediately, buildings I remembered Marcus closing with genuine pride, into this new entity I had never heard of. And at the bottom of several documents, a signature that looked almost exactly like my own. Almost. I want you to sit with that word for just a moment the way I had to sit with it that afternoon. Almost mine, close enough to pass anyone glancing at it quickly, not close enough to survive anyone who actually looked. I did not confront Marcus that night, and I want to explain honestly why. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to recognition, the specific feeling that arrives when a suspicion you have been quietly carrying for months finally receives its confirmation, and your first instinct is not panic at all but a strange, focused clarity. Before I photographed a single page, I remained on that office floor a while longer, letting myself think through the years that had led directly to this folder. I thought about the small apartment we shared before we could afford anything better, the one with a radiator that clanked all winter long and a window that never fully closed. I thought about the year I took on extra design clients, working nights and weekends, so that Marcus could finally leave his position at a larger firm and start his own development company. I remembered handing him a check drawn from my own modest savings, everything I had at the time, and him promising with what felt like complete sincerity that he would never forget what that sacrifice meant. I thought about the specific pride I felt watching his company grow, genuinely, for years, long before any of this began, long before Ashworth Property Holdings existed as anything beyond an idea quietly forming somewhere in Marcus's mind that he had never once shared with me. I want to tell you about a dinner we shared exactly 1 week before I discovered that folder because I have turned it over in my memory many times since, searching for any sign I might have missed. Marcus had made a reservation at a restaurant we had not visited in years, the very restaurant, in fact, where he had once proposed to me. He ordered wine that night. He asked about my business, my current projects, in a way that felt at the time like genuine interest rather than what I now understand it most likely was, a kind of careful maintenance, keeping the ordinary surface of our marriage looking sound while the actual foundation had already been hollowed out beneath us. He told me that night that he loved me. I remember exactly where we were seated, exactly what I wore, because it is the sort of detail your mind holds onto tightly once you understand in hindsight that it may have been a lie, or may have been true and simply insufficient to stop what he had already set into motion. I have come to believe in the time since that both things are capable of being true at once. That Marcus may have loved me, in whatever limited and self-serving way he was capable of love, and that this feeling coexisted without apparent conflict in his mind, alongside 2 years of systematic financial betrayal carried out against me. I do not offer that observation as forgiveness. I offer it because I believe it sits closer to the actual truth than a simpler story where he never cared for me at all. I photographed every single page in that folder, working through each document twice to be certain the images were clear enough to read every line if I needed them later. I returned everything exactly where I had found it, adjusting the folder's position in the drawer to match my memory of its original placement, then closed the cabinet completely. I did not sleep much that night. I lay beside Marcus, listening to his breathing settle into the familiar rhythm of sleep, running through every possible explanation my mind could construct. Perhaps there was a reasonable answer. Perhaps Ashworth Property Holdings was some kind of tax structure his accountant had recommended, something entirely ordinary that simply appeared alarming to someone without his financial background. Perhaps the signature that looked almost like mine had an explanation I had not yet considered. I want to be honest about how badly, that particular night, I wanted one of those gentler explanations to actually be true. The next morning, I made a phone call I had been quietly avoiding for far longer than I wanted to admit even to myself. I called a woman named Diane Whitfield, my closest friend since college, and as it would turn out, the person who would help me take back everything Marcus believed he had already taken from me. Diane and I had been friends since our sophomore year of college, back when we shared a cramped dormitory room and split the cost of a coffee maker neither of us could genuinely afford. She went on to law school while I moved into design work, and although our lives took different shapes over the years, our friendship never thinned the way so many college friendships eventually do. We had dinner together every few months. We called each other on birthdays without fail. She had built a career in corporate and family law, sharp, thorough, the kind of attorney other attorneys were careful around in negotiations. When I called her that Wednesday morning, I did not lead with pleasantries. I told her I needed to see her in person that same day if at all possible, and that I needed her to look at some documents before I said another word out loud. Diane did not ask why over the phone. She simply told me to come to her office at 11 that morning. I sat across from her desk 2 hours later with my phone in my hand, scrolling slowly through the photographs I had taken the day before. My hands, I remember, were steady, which surprised me at the time. I had expected to be shaking. Instead, I felt strangely calm, the specific calm that arrives when a fear you have been carrying quietly for months finally takes on a shape you can point toward directly. Diane studied the photographs slowly, one at a time, her expression giving nothing away. She has always been like that professionally, careful never to react until she is entirely certain of what she is reacting to. When she finally finished, she set my phone down on the desk between us and folded her hands together and asked me plainly whether I had signed any of these documents myself. I told her no, not one of them. She asked if I had any knowledge at all of Ashworth Property Holdings, any conversation with Marcus about it, ever, even in passing. I told her none. She asked about Vivian Cole, whose name appeared clearly as the registered agent, and I explained that Vivian was a project coordinator at Marcus's company, someone I had met only twice. Diane was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke again, her voice had shifted into something more careful, more precise than before. She told me she needed to be completely straightforward with me because that was exactly what I was going to need from her going forward. What I was describing, she said, if it turned out to be what it appeared to be, was not simply a difficult divorce. It was potential fraud, forged signatures on property transfer documents. Marital assets moved into a separate entity, a third party listed as registered agent. This was the kind of situation that required a forensic accountant, not only a family attorney. She could help me through this, she said, but she needed me to understand clearly what I might be walking into before we took another step forward together. I told her I understood. I am not entirely certain, honestly, that I did understand fully in that moment. but I understood enough to know that I needed to keep moving forward regardless. There was something else she told me. If we handled this properly, if we built an actual case instead of simply confronting Marcus and hopping, he told us the truth voluntarily, it was going to take real time. Weeks, quite possibly months. During that entire period, I could not allow him to suspect what I had already found, not the smallest hint, not any change in how I behaved toward him at home. He needed to believe that everything remained completely normal between us, because the moment he suspected I knew something, he would have every opportunity to move assets further, destroy records entirely, or worse, construct a narrative that painted me as unstable or dishonest before I had finished building my case against him. Men who do this kind of thing rarely do it only once, she said. They plan carefully for the possibility of being discovered eventually. If Marcus believed I was already onto him, he would adjust his behavior immediately, and an adjusted opponent becomes far more difficult to catch. I asked her what that would actually mean, practically, for how I needed to live my life over the following months. It meant, she said, that I would go home that night and remain exactly who I had always been to him. I would sign absolutely nothing without photographing it first and sending it directly to her before my name touched the page. I would keep my eyes open at all times and let her handle everything else from that point forward. I want to pause here and describe honestly what those following weeks actually felt like from the inside, because I believe this is the part of the story that rarely comes across accurately once everything has already been resolved. It requires an exhausting, very specific kind of performance to sit across the dinner table from a man you have shared 15 years of your life with, to laugh genuinely at his jokes, to ask sincerely about his day, to fold his laundry exactly as you always have, all while quietly carrying the knowledge that he has been systematically stealing from you with a precision that suggests he has either done this before, or planned this particular deception for a very long time. There were nights I sat alone in our bathroom with the faucet running so Marcus would not overhear me on the phone with Diane, reviewing new documents, new questions, new pieces of the financial structure Marcus had quietly built without my knowledge. There were mornings I made his coffee exactly the way I always had, handed it to him without hesitation, and watched him accept it without a single flicker of suspicion crossing his face, while something in my own chest hardened into a very cold, very focused resolve that I had never experienced before in my life. 3 weeks into this process, Diane's forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Patricia Nkemelu who had worked alongside Diane on 2 prior fraud cases, uncovered the first major piece of the actual structure Marcus had built. Ashworth Property Holdings had been formed nearly 2 years earlier, not months as I had first assumed, but years, and during that entire period, income from 3 separate properties Marcus and I jointly owned had been gradually redirected into accounts tied directly to that entity. Not all at once, slowly, incrementally, in the specific kind of movement designed to remain beneath the threshold of anything either of us would notice during a routine financial review. 2 years, I remember saying to Diane when she told me he had been doing this for 2 entire years. At least 2 years, she corrected gently. Patricia was still working backward through the earlier records. It was entirely possible this went back even further than we currently knew. I remember sitting with that particular number for a long time after we ended that call. 2 years. 2 years of birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesday dinners together, all of it happening while Marcus quietly constructed an entirely separate financial life underneath the one we supposedly shared completely. The question of the forged signature resolved itself roughly 1 week later, and this particular piece turned my stomach in a way the earlier financial details, painful as they were, had not quite managed to accomplish. Patricia brought in a forensic document examiner, a specialist trained to compare signatures the way investigators compare fingerprints, examining stroke pressure and letter formation, and all the subtle habits that make a signature genuinely yours, rather than a careful imitation of it. The examiner's final report was unambiguous. The signatures appearing on 4 separate property transfer documents were not mine. They were forgeries, competent ones, clearly produced by someone with direct access to genuine examples of my actual signature to study and carefully replicate. Who would have that kind of access? I asked Diane, though some part of me had already begun suspecting the answer before I even finished asking the question aloud. Someone close to your household, she said carefully. Someone who could obtain genuine samples of your signature without raising any suspicion at all. A spouse, most likely, or someone that spouse trusted enough to hand those materials over to directly. I thought immediately about Vivian Cole's name listed on the registered agent line. I thought about how often over the past 2 years I had signed cards, forms, checks, even documents for a niece's college fund, all of it happening in Marcus's presence, all without a second thought about where those signatures might eventually end up, or who exactly might be quietly studying them in the meantime. This is the part of the story where I need to tell you about the moment I first learned about the party. It arrived by mail, an actual physical invitation, thick cream cardstock, elegant flowing script across the front. A celebration of new beginnings, it read, followed by a date 6 weeks in the future, and beneath that in smaller print, both our names listed together as though we were somehow jointly hosting our own farewell to each other. I stood in my kitchen holding that invitation for a very long time. Diane had already warned me something like this might happen eventually. Marcus was the kind of man, she had explained, based on everything we had uncovered together so far, who required an audience for his decisions, who understood clearly that public performance could shape a narrative far faster and far more permanently than private truth ever could on its own. If he could stand in front of 200 people and present the ending of our marriage as his own triumphant new beginning, he could effectively control how everyone we had ever known would understand what happened between us, long before I ever had the chance to offer my own version of these events. I called Diane that same night and read her the entire invitation word for word over the phone. There was a long pause on the line after I finished, and then Diane said something I have thought about many times since that night. She told me she thought she should attend this party herself. I asked her what exactly she meant by that. She said that if Marcus wanted an audience for his ending, then perhaps we should give him one. She simply did not think he understood yet exactly who was going to be standing quietly in that particular audience alongside everyone else. There is a part of this story I have not told you yet, and I think it matters because it is the part where I almost lost my nerve entirely. 10 days before the party, Diane called me late on a Tuesday night, later than she usually called, and I remember answering with my heart already picking up speed before she had said a single word, the way you learn to read urgency in the timing of a phone call alone. She told me she needed me to stay calm, which is, of course, the exact sentence that guarantees you won't. Marcus's attorney had requested an emergency meeting with the court the following morning. She did not yet know what it concerned. I sat up in bed. Marcus was asleep beside me or performing sleep. I genuinely could not tell anymore by that point, and I remember lying there afterward in the dark, phone still warm in my hand, running through every possible explanation. Had he found something? Had Vivian said something to him, some flicker of nervousness that tipped him off? Had 4 months of careful, controlled performance been undone by a single miscalculation I had not even noticed making? Diane called again at 8 the next morning. The emergency meeting, it turned out, had nothing to do with our case at all. It concerned an unrelated zoning dispute on one of Marcus's other properties, a coincidence of timing that meant nothing beyond the ordinary chaos of a busy real estate practice. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor after that call, back against the cabinet, the same way I imagine anyone sits after adrenaline drains out of a body that spent 12 hours preparing for a fight that was never actually coming. Relief and exhaustion in equal measure. I tell you this not because it changed anything about the outcome, but because I want you to understand what those 4 months actually felt like from the inside. It was not a steady, confident march toward justice. It was closer to walking across a frozen lake you are fairly certain will hold your weight, listening for every crack, most of them not real, and never quite able to stop listening until you have reached the other side. There was a second scare 5 days before the party, this one more substantial. Patricia's investigation had, up to that point, focused almost entirely on Ashworth Property Holdings and the 3 refinanced properties. But while cross-referencing bank records, she flagged an unusual pattern of withdrawals from a joint account Marcus, and I still shared small amounts, a few $100s here and there, moved into an account she could not immediately identify. It could be nothing, Patricia told Diane, who relayed it to me that same afternoon. It could also mean he had suspected something and started building a secondary structure we had not mapped yet. I remember the specific dread of that possibility, the idea that after 4 months of careful work, Marcus might have quietly begun constructing an entirely new layer of concealment, one step ahead of us the way he had apparently been for 2 years already. Diane asked Patricia to prioritize tracing those withdrawals immediately, and for 3 days, I lived with the very real possibility that everything we had built might be one step behind a man who had already had a 2-year head start on hiding what he did not want found. The answer, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The withdrawals traced to a golf club membership renewal and a series of client dinners entirely mundane, entirely unrelated to Ashworth. Patricia confirmed it 2 days before the party. I remember Diane's voice on the phone, careful as always, but with something warmer underneath it, telling me it was clean. Just golf, she said. I laughed that day for the first time in what felt like weeks. A real laugh, not the careful, managed version I had been performing at dinner with Marcus every night. Diane laughed too. It is strange, the specific relief of discovering your husband's secrecy is, in one particular instance, exactly as boring as it appears. But the scare had done something useful in retrospect. In double-checking every account for signs of a secondary concealment structure, Patricia found something else instead, something that had not been the focus of her search but that would become, in the following weeks, one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case. A single wire transfer, 18 months earlier, moving funds from Ashworth directly into a property purchase, the future arrangement home Diane had described to me weeks before, the one Marcus and Vivian had discussed as where he intended to live once our divorce was finalized. That transfer included a memo line, a small administrative detail that property transfer software often generates automatically and that almost no one thinks to scrutinize. It read simply Ashworth Holdings, M.A. residence transfer. M.A. Marcus Ashford's own initials, on a transfer he had apparently believed was buried deep enough in an obscure account that no one would ever cross-reference it against his own name. He labeled it himself, Diane told me, and I could hear something in her voice that I had not heard in the 4 months I had known her as my attorney rather than simply my friend, a kind of quiet, professional satisfaction. Men who believe they are untouchable get careless in the smallest ways, she said. He did not think anyone would ever be looking closely enough to notice a memo line. That single line of text would become, in the following months, one of the pieces of evidence Diane's team leaned on: hardest, direct, documented proof connecting Marcus's own hand to the structure, undermining any argument his attorney might have tried to make that Vivian had acted independently, or that the forged signatures represented some rogue action he had not personally directed. I did not know, standing in that tent 5 days later watching Marcus raise a glass of champagne to 200 unknowing guests, that a memo line he had typed 18 months earlier and immediately forgotten about was about to become one of the central pieces of evidence that would end his career. I only knew that Diane had told me quietly the night before the party that we had enough, more than enough. Whatever happened tomorrow night, she told me he had already lost. He simply did not know it yet. The morning of the party, I woke up before my alarm, the way you do when your body already understands something significant is coming before your mind has fully caught up. I made coffee. I sat at our kitchen island and drank it slowly, watching the light move across the backyard where, by that afternoon, 200 people would be gathering to watch my marriage end on Marcus's terms. Diane called me at 9 that morning to confirm that the freeze was in effect. As of 8:15 that morning, every account connected to Ashworth Property Holdings had been locked by court order. Marcus's attorney would be formally notified through the court system sometime in the next several business days, but given how these notifications typically processed, there was a strong chance he would not see anything before that night. I asked her what would happen if he checked the accounts himself before then. She explained that he would simply see they were frozen without understanding why, not without legal notice explaining the basis. He would likely assume it was a banking error. People do not usually think emergency asset freeze first. They think smaller, more ordinary explanations until someone tells them otherwise. I asked Diane, for what felt like the 100th time in 4 months, whether she was certain she wanted to come to the party herself, rather than simply letting the legal process unfold quietly through the appropriate channels in the days that followed. She told me that Marcus had built a stage. He had invited 200 people to watch him narrate the end of our marriage exactly how he wanted it told. She believed I deserved to have someone in that audience who already knew the truth. She would stay quiet unless the moment called for otherwise, but she was not going to miss it. The party began at 6 that evening. I arrived at 6:30 deliberately, not wanting to be there for the earliest arrivals and the small talk that came with them. The backyard had been transformed almost beyond recognition. A white tent covering most of the lawn, string lights woven carefully through the trees, a small stage with a microphone stand positioned near the back, close enough to the house that Marcus's voice would carry clearly across the entire gathering. A 4-piece band was setting up near the bar. Catering staff moved between tables with trays of appetizers. It looked, I remember thinking, like a wedding, which I suppose, in Marcus's mind, in some sense it was, a wedding to the next chapter of his life, with me invited only to formally witness my own exclusion from it. Marcus found me near the entrance almost immediately, dressed in a crisp navy suit, clearly pleased with how the setup had come together. He asked me what I thought. I told him it was a lot, which was true and which he took as a compliment. I moved through the party over the next hour the way I imagine soldiers move through unfamiliar terrain, carefully, deliberately, cataloging everything without appearing to catalog anything. I spoke with neighbors I had known for a decade. I hugged cousins who clearly had no idea what the actual shape of this evening was about to become. I watched Vivian Cole arrive around 7, dressed elegantly, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a woman who believed her position in Marcus's life was secure and increasingly public. She smiled at me once from across the tent, a small, careful smile that I understood now for exactly what it was. Diane arrived at 7:15, introduced by Marcus himself to a cluster of guests near the bar as an old friend of Renee from college, a description that was, on its face, entirely accurate and entirely insufficient. She wore a navy dress, simple, elegant, unremarkable in a room full of similarly dressed guests. She carried a small clutch. I knew because she had told me that morning that inside that clutch was a single folded document, the formal notice of the emergency asset freeze and fraud filing, printed and ready, though Diane had assured me she had no intention of producing it unless the moment specifically called for it. Her plan, she had explained, was simpler than that. She wanted to be present, she wanted to watch, and she wanted Marcus to eventually understand exactly who had been standing in his audience the entire time. The toast happened around 8:30, once most of the 200 guests had arrived and the light had softened into the particular gold of early evening. Marcus climbed onto the small stage, tapped the microphone twice, and waited for the crowd's attention to gather toward him the way it always did, easily, willingly, the natural pull of a man who had spent his career learning exactly how to command a room. He thanked everyone for being there, and I watched 200 faces turn toward him with genuine warmth, most of them with no idea what they were actually about to witness. He told them that tonight was not a sad occasion, that he knew that might sound strange for what some of them might assume was simply a divorce party. Laughter rippled through the crowd. He said he wanted to celebrate something important that night, which was honesty, the courage it takes to admit when something has run its course, and the grace it takes to let it go well. I stood near the back of the tent, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, and let him speak. Diane stood roughly 15 feet to my left, close enough that I could see her expression remain perfectly composed, patient, watching. Marcus continued for several more minutes, talking about growth, about new beginnings, about gratitude for the years we had shared, even as he framed their ending as an inevitable, almost noble progression. He mentioned me by name twice, both times with a carefully constructed generosity that painted the picture of a woman being released rather than a woman being systematically defrauded for 2 years, while her husband built a second financial life underneath her. And then, toward the end of his toast, he made a mistake. Not a large one, not one anyone else in that tent would have registered as significant. He said, raising his glass slightly toward the crowd near the bar, that he wanted to thank everyone who had supported him through the business side of things this past year too, that building something like the downtown project while managing a divorce was not easy, and that he had incredible people in his corner. His eyes moved briefly, unmistakably, toward Vivian Cole. It was such a small gesture. A glance, half a second, nothing that would mean anything to 200 people who did not know what Diane and I knew. But I watched Diane's expression shift just slightly, and I understood that she had seen exactly what I had seen, and that the moment she had been waiting 4 months for had just quietly arrived. Diane did not rush the stage. She did not create a scene in the dramatic way you might expect. What she did was simpler, and in its own way far more devastating. As Marcus finished his toast and the crowd began to applaud, Diane walked, unhurried, toward the small stage, timing her approach for the moment just after the applause settled, and before the band resumed playing, the small window of relative quiet that exists at the end of every speech. She stopped near the base of the stage, close enough that Marcus, stepping down, found himself almost directly in front of her. She told him they had not been properly introduced that night, that her name was Diane Whitfield. Marcus extended his hand, still riding the warmth of his own toast, greeting her as Renee's college friend, thanking her for coming. She told him she was my friend. She was also my attorney. I watched the shift happen across Marcus's face in real time, the specific transition from social warmth to a kind of frozen, calculating stillness, the look of a man whose mind is very quickly trying to determine how much danger he is actually standing in. He repeated the word attorney back to her. She told him that yes, for the past 4 months she had been my attorney, that she had filed for divorce on my behalf 6 days earlier, along with several additional claims he would be formally notified about through the appropriate channels, and that she imagined that notice may already be waiting for him, given the timing. Marcus's smile had not fully disappeared, but it had become something else entirely, a kind of frozen performance for the handful of nearby guests who were beginning to sense, without fully understanding why, that something had shifted in the air around them. He said he thought they should discuss this privately, his voice tightening. Diane told him they could, but she wanted him to know before the evening went any further that as of 8:15 that morning, the court had granted an emergency freeze on all accounts associated with Ashworth Property Holdings. She let the names sit in the air between them for a moment. She told him she imagined he would want to check his phone at some point that night. I have never in 15 years of marriage watched Marcus's face lose color the way it did in that moment. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to the specific vertigo of a man realizing all at once that a structure he had spent 2 years carefully building had just been, quietly and completely, exposed. He said this was a misunderstanding, his voice dropping, his eyes moving briefly, involuntarily, toward Vivian Cole across the tent, who had gone very still near the bar, watching this exchange with an expression I could not fully read. Diane told him simply that it was not, but they could discuss the specifics somewhere more appropriate than his own party. The band, sensing the shift in energy near the stage the way bands often do, began playing again, filling the space with music that most of the 200 guests gratefully returned their attention to, unaware of the specific earthquake that had just occurred in a 15-foot radius near the stage. Marcus stood there for a long moment, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I watched him without any clear plan for what to say next. He looked across the tent at me, finally, directly, and I held his gaze the way I had been holding it in every mediation session I had not yet had, every conversation I had rehearsed in my mind over the past 4 months. I did not smile. I did not look away. He was the one who looked away first. The party did not end abruptly. That surprised me in retrospect. I think I had imagined, in the months of anticipation leading up to that night, that Diane's revelation would bring the entire event crashing to some dramatic, visible halt. Instead, it continued for another hour and a half, the band playing, guests mingling, most of them entirely unaware that the man who had built the tent over their heads had just learned his financial architecture was collapsing in real time. Marcus disappeared for nearly 20 minutes not long after his conversation with Diane, and I later learned through the discovery process in the following weeks that he had spent that time in his car in the driveway on the phone, first with his attorney, then, according to phone records that would later become relevant to the case, with Vivian Cole directly, a call that lasted 4 minutes and that Vivian would later describe under deposition as Marcus telling her to stay calm and stick to the plan. A phrase that would end up meaning something very different to investigators than it likely meant to Vivian in the moment. When Marcus returned to the party, he was composed again, or performing composure well enough that most guests noticed nothing beyond a host briefly stepping away to handle something. He circulated for the remainder of the evening with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his career managing rooms even when the ground beneath him had shifted. I will give him that. Whatever else is true about Marcus, he was, until that night, remarkably good at appearing unbothered. I left the party a little after 10, before most of the guests had gone, walking out past the string lights and the half-empty champagne glasses, and the band still playing something slow and unbothered by the specific unraveling that had occurred beneath it. Diane walked out with me. Neither of us said much in the car. I remember she reached over at one point and squeezed my hand briefly, and that was enough. The weeks that followed moved faster than the 4 months that had preceded them, the way these things often do once the structure finally becomes visible to everyone involved. Marcus's attorney formally responded to the fraud filing 11 days after the party, and Diane described the response, when she called to walk me through it, as measured, which I came to understand was her professional way of saying that Marcus's legal team had recognized, quickly, the strength of the forensic case against him and had shifted from an adversarial posture to something closer to damage control. Criminal referral came next. Diane had explained to me early in the process that fraud of this scale, forged signatures, deliberately structured asset concealment, was not simply a civil matter to be resolved through divorce proceedings. The forensic accountant's report, combined with the document examiner's findings on the forged signatures, met the threshold for referral to the district attorney's financial crimes unit. I want to be honest, this was not a decision I made lightly or vindictively. Diane walked me through the implications carefully. The reality that a criminal investigation would extend the timeline, would become a matter of public record, would mean depositions and formal interviews that I had not fully anticipated when this began as simply a discovery in a filing cabinet. But I also understood by that point that what Marcus had done was not a private failing between two people. He had forged my legal signature on documents worth a significant portion of our joint marital assets. That is not just a marriage ending badly. That is a crime, and pretending otherwise for the sake of a quieter resolution felt like a second betrayal I was not willing to hand him. Vivian Cole's role became clearer during this period in ways that surprised even Diane. Under the pressure of the forensic evidence, and facing potential criminal exposure of her own, as the named registered agent on the fraudulent entity, Vivian's attorney reached out to Diane's office roughly 3 weeks after the party to discuss the possibility of cooperation. What emerged from that cooperation was more complete than anything Patricia's investigation had uncovered independently. Vivian confirmed, in a formal statement given to investigators, the full sequence of the Ashworth Property Holdings formation, confirmed that Marcus had directed her to sign as registered agent, and confirmed, perhaps most significantly, a pattern of communication in which Marcus had explicitly discussed the forged signatures with her. Conversations that established his direct knowledge and intent rather than leaving room for any argument that the forgeries had been the work of some other party without his awareness. I want to pause on this because I have thought about it many times since. Vivian was not cooperating out of remorse, at least not primarily. Her attorney's strategy was straightforward. Early, thorough cooperation in a case with this much documented evidence was her best path toward avoiding criminal charges of her own. She made a calculation, the same kind of calculation she had likely been making throughout her involvement with Marcus and his business, and this time the calculation ran against him rather than alongside him. The court hearing took place a little over 4 months after the party. I remember waking up that morning and eating a full breakfast, which felt significant somehow, a small act of caring for myself that I had not always managed easily during the preceding year. I wore a simple charcoal dress. Diane wore her usual composed navy. Marcus arrived with his attorney, dressed sharply, though I noticed, sitting across the courtroom from him, that some of the easy confidence I had known for 15 years had thinned into something more brittle. The forensic accountant, Patricia, testified first, walking the court through nearly 2 years of financial records with the same careful precision she had brought to every meeting throughout the investigation. She laid out the formation of Ashworth Property Holdings, the pattern of refinancing, the redirection of marital assets, methodically without embellishment, the kind of testimony that did not need dramatic flourishes because the underlying facts carried their own weight. The document examiner testified next, walking the court through the forensic signature analysis, 4 separate forged documents, each one compared stroke by stroke against verified samples of my genuine signature, the differences subtle to an untrained eye and unmistakable to a trained one. Diane submitted Vivian's cooperating statement into evidence, along with the phone records and text messages that corroborated the timeline she had described. Marcus's attorney requested a brief recess after that submission, and during those 10 minutes sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom, I found myself, for a moment, standing near Marcus himself, the two of us separated by only a few feet of hallway and considerably more than that in every other sense. He looked at me. I remember the specific quality of that look, something that had lost all of the polish and control I had known him for. He told me quietly that he never meant for it to go this far. I thought about the folder in his filing cabinet. I thought about 2 years of ordinary Tuesday dinners happening on top of a financial structure designed specifically to eventually leave me with nothing. I thought about the tent, the band, the 200 guests he had invited specifically to watch me absorb the ending of our marriage on his terms. I told him I know, and I walked back into the courtroom. The ruling, when it came, was thorough. The court found clear and convincing evidence of fraudulent concealment of marital assets and forged signatures on legal property documents. Ashworth Property Holdings was dissolved by court order, its assets, the full amount Patricia had traced across 2 years of records, restored to the marital estate and subject to division. Given the fraud finding, the court awarded a disproportionate share of the marital assets to me, along with compensatory damages related to the forged documents themselves. The marital home was awarded to me outright. And the court formally referred the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution on charges of forgery and financial fraud, a process that would, over the following year, result in Marcus pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for restitution and a suspended sentence, his real estate license permanently revoked as a condition of the plea, effectively ending the career he had spent 2 decades building. Vivian Cole, given her cooperation, avoided criminal charges herself, though she was named in a civil judgment tied to her role as registered agent, a judgment that would follow her professionally and publicly for years afterward. I walked out of that courthouse into late afternoon light, Diane beside me, and I remember feeling something I had not expected to feel after 4 months of careful, controlled patience. Not triumph exactly, something quieter and steadier than that. something closer to the specific relief of watching a structure finally hold the weight it had been built for. I want to tell you what actually happened in the months after that hearing because I think the specifics matter more than a general sense that things eventually worked out. The first few weeks were strange in a way I had not anticipated. I had spent 4 months so thoroughly focused on building a case, on performing normalcy at dinner, on absorbing revelation after revelation with careful composure, that once it was actually over, I found I did not quite know what to do with the sudden absence of all that vigilance. Grace stayed with me for the first 10 days, and I remember being grateful for her presence in a way I had not fully let myself be during the months I was protecting her, and everyone else from what I actually knew. She told me one night sitting across from me at the kitchen island that I could have told her that she would have kept my secret. I told her I knew that, but Diane had been right. Every person who knew was a person who might even unintentionally tip Marcus off. A different expression at Sunday dinner. A question you could not quite keep casual. I needed everyone around me to be as genuinely unaware as he was, so that nothing about how I was living gave anything away. Grace understood that, I think, though I know it cost her something too, learning after the fact that I had carried 4 months of this alone, with only Diane and Patricia as company inside the truth of it. Curtis Boyd, Marcus's former business partner, reached out to me about 6 weeks after the hearing, an email careful and formal, expressing what he described as his genuine regret at not pressing harder on the financial irregularities he had sensed, but had not been able to substantiate over the preceding year. I appreciated the gesture, though I understood it for what it was too, a man protecting his own professional reputation as much as extending real sympathy. Curtis had already begun distancing his firm from any association with Marcus's name well before the hearing became public record, and within a year he had rebranded his development company entirely, scrubbing nearly every reference to their prior partnership from his firm's history. I started my design business's rebuild slowly. The way Diane had warned me, most real recoveries actually happen, not in a single dramatic turn, but in a long series of unremarkable, steady decisions. I took on smaller projects at first, ones I could manage entirely myself without needing to lean on the larger network of contractors and vendors Marcus had, in subtle ways I had not fully appreciated until they were gone, always positioned himself near. Within a year, I had rebuilt that network on my own terms, one that did not run through him or his reputation at all. The house took longer to feel like mine than I expected. I repainted the primary bedroom within the first month, a soft sage green Marcus had vetoed years earlier in favor of the neutral gray he preferred throughout the house. I remember standing in that room after the second coat had dried, genuinely surprised by how much smaller a decision like paint color could feel, and how much it somehow was not small at all. Diane and I still have dinner every few months, the way we did long before any of this began, though our conversations now carry an entirely different kind of history underneath them. She mentioned to me once, almost in passing, that our case had become something of a reference point in her office, the kind of file junior associates were shown as an example of what patient, methodical fraud investigation could actually accomplish when done correctly. I told her I was glad something useful had come out of it beyond my own outcome. She said that was, in her experience, usually how the good ones went, someone's worst year becoming, eventually, someone else's education. I ran into Vivian Cole exactly once, about 8 months after the hearing, at a home goods store on the opposite side of town from either of our usual routines. We saw each other from 2 aisles apart, and I watched something pass across her face, not quite guilt, not quite defiance, something more complicated than either. Neither of us approached the other. I do not know what I would have said if we had. I think, honestly, there was not anything left to say that the legal record had not already said more precisely than either of us could have managed in a home goods aisle. Marcus and I have spoken twice since the hearing, both times through necessary logistics, transferring the title on a car, forwarding a piece of mail that arrived at the house addressed to him months after he had moved out. Both conversations were brief, professional, and entirely unremarkable, which is, I have come to understand, its own kind of ending. Not dramatic, just quiet and complete. I think often about that tent, the string lights, the band, the 200 faces turned toward Marcus as he spoke about honesty and new beginnings while standing on top of a financial deception he had spent 2 years constructing. I think about how confident he was that night, how certain he seemed that he controlled every version of the story that would leave that backyard. What Marcus never understood, and what I hope the story makes clear, is that the version of yourself you present to a crowd of 200 people means very little if it is not true underneath. He built an elaborate performance because he believed performance was the same thing as truth, that if enough people watched him say something with confidence, it would simply become the accepted account of what happened between us. For a while in some rooms it might have. But truth has its own patience. It does not need an audience of 200. It sometimes only needs one person quietly building a case in the background while everyone else is watching the show. I think about Diane often, standing at that party in her navy dress, watching, waiting, carrying a folded document in a small clutch that she never actually needed to produce. Because the truth, once it arrived, did not need theatrics to land. It simply needed to be said clearly at the right moment to the right person. I built my design business back up over the following 2 years, slower than I might have liked, but steadily the way most real things get built. I bought out my share of the house entirely, repainted every room Marcus had chosen, and discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that I liked my own taste considerably more than the compromises I had been making for 15 years without fully realizing it. Gray still brings up that hallway moment sometimes, when Marcus told me he never meant for it to go that far, and I told him I know and walked back into the courtroom. She says it is the most Renee thing I have ever done, not screaming, not crying, just 2 words and a closed door. I think she is right. I think somewhere in those 4 months of careful patience I became someone slightly different than the woman who found that folder in the filing cabinet. Not harder, exactly. Just more precise about what I was willing to carry and what I was not. So I will leave you with the question I keep coming back to myself. Marcus spent 6 months planning a party designed to control a narrative in front of 200 witnesses. He never once considered that the truth might already be sitting quietly in that crowd, waiting for its own moment to speak. How many of us are performing a version of our lives for an audience, while the truth waits patiently somewhere in the room we haven't thought to look? Was justice really served here, or was it simply delayed long enough to look that way? I would love to know what you think. If this story meant something to you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe because there's another story waiting for you next, and I promise it's just as unforgettable.